Find somewhere comfortable tonight. Wherever you are, whatever position your body has settled into, that is exactly the right place to be. You don't need to follow any of this closely. You don't need to hold on to the details or remember the names or keep track of anything at all. Just let the words come to you the way a quiet story might arrive on the edge of sleep. Soft, unhurried. Something to accompany you as the day finally lets go. If today was hard, you can put it down now. Whatever you carried through those hours, whatever felt unresolved or heavy or too much, none of it needs your attention in this moment. The night has a way of holding things gently while we rest. Tonight we're going somewhere very distant. Not in miles exactly, though the place is real and you could find it on a map. We're going back through time, back through layers of silence and stone and dry desert air, to a moment when a young shepherd boy threw a rock into a cave and, without knowing it, changed everything we thought we understood about the ancient world. The story we're settling into tonight is more than 2,000 years old. It involves people who live quietly on the edge of a salt sea, who wrote in careful hands on long sheets of animal skin, who hid their most precious words in jars of clay and left them to the darkness of limestone caves. They did not know we would find them. They did not imagine us, here in this distant future, reading what they wrote by the light of screens or letting those words drift through the air as something to fall asleep to. And yet here we are. And here they are too, in a way. Still present. Still quiet. Still waiting. So settle in. Let your body grow heavy and slow. We have no destination to reach tonight, no conclusions to arrive at. Only a long, gentle wander through one of the most beautiful mysteries that time has ever left behind. It begins, as so many remarkable things do, entirely by accident. The year is 1946, and the world is still exhaling from the long violence of the Second Great War. In the West Bank, near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, a teenage Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Edib is doing what shepherds have always done. He's watching his flock move slowly across sun-baked rock and pale dust, and he is not finding one of his goats. The landscape there is extraordinary in its stillness. The Dead Sea sits nearly 1,400 feet below the level of the ocean, the lowest place on the surface of the earth. The air is thick with mineral salt. Nothing much grows. The cliffs along the western shore are pockmarked with caves, carved by water and time into the pale limestone, and they have been there so long that no one thinks much about them anymore. Muhammad picks up a stone and throws it into one of those caves, the way a bored or curious young person might. He is not looking for treasure. He is not conducting an archaeological survey. He is just throwing a rock. And then he hears something unexpected, not a thud, not silence. He hears the sound of pottery breaking. Curious now, and perhaps a little wary, he goes to look. Inside the cave, he finds several tall clay jars, sealed, still standing after more than 2,000 years in the dry desert darkness. And inside the jars, wrapped carefully in linen, are scrolls of ancient leather. Dark with age, fragile. Covered in writing he cannot read. He does not know what he has found. He takes the scrolls and, over the following months, they pass through several hands. It is Sukenik who first understands, with a quiet and building certainty, that these scrolls predate any Hebrew manuscripts previously known to exist. That they are not centuries old. That they are millennia old. And so begins the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The cave where Muhammad threw his rock would come to be known as Cave 1. Over the following decade, 10 more caves in the same region would yield their own treasures. Nearly 900 different manuscripts in total. Some almost perfectly preserved. Many shattered into thousands of fragments like ancient puzzles scattered across centuries of desert floor, all of them waiting, patient in the dark. Chapter 1. The Desert and the People Who Chose It. To understand what was found in those caves, it helps to know something about the place where they were found and about the people who most scholars believe put them there. The site is called Qumran. Qurbet is an Arabic word meaning ruins, and ruins is precisely what Qumran was by the time anyone went looking. A low plateau of crumbling stone walls and cisterns and the foundations of old rooms sitting perhaps a mile from the caves, overlooking the pale shimmer of the Dead Sea. People had lived there on and off for a long time. But in the period that concerns us, roughly from the 2nd century before the Common Era until about 68 CE, Qumran was home to a very particular kind of community. A group who had chosen, deliberately and with great intention, to leave the cities behind. The world they were leaving was complicated. Jerusalem, roughly 20 miles to the northwest, was a city of political tension and religious dispute. The temple, the center of Jewish worship and identity, was a place of competing factions and what many devout Jews considered corruption. The priests who ran it were, in the eyes of some, too cozy with foreign powers, too willing to compromise the old ways for political convenience. And so some people left. They walked out into the desert, past the last olive trees and the last wells, down toward the lowest point on earth, and they built a life there. A community organized around a very particular set of beliefs and practices. A community that believed it was living in the final days of the age, that a cosmic reckoning was coming, and that the best way to prepare for it was to live purely, to study deeply, and to copy the sacred texts with meticulous, devoted care. Most scholars identify this group as the Essenes, a Jewish sect described by several ancient writers, among them the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, and the Roman author Pliny the Elder. Pliny, writing in the 1st century, even places an Essene settlement near the Dead Sea, describing a community of men who lived without women, without money, and with only palm trees for company. Whether every scroll found in the caves came from this community is still a matter of quiet, scholarly debate. Some researchers believe that at least some of the manuscripts were brought from Jerusalem, perhaps by priests fleeing the advancing Roman army during the First Jewish Revolt, which began in 66 CE. Others maintain that the Qumran community produced or collected nearly everything found there. The question remains open, like so many of the most interesting questions about this place. But the community itself, whatever we call them, left behind something remarkable. Not just their words. Their world. The archaeological remains at Qumran include large cisterns for ritual bathing, a room that may have been used for communal meals, and what many researchers believe was a scriptorium. A room for writing, long tables, possibly of plaster, where scribes would sit for hours in the dry desert heat, dipping reed pens into inkwells, drawing letter after careful letter across sheets of prepared animal skin. The life they lived was austere by almost any standard we might apply. They rose early, they prayed, they worked, they studied, they ate communally, they shared their possessions. New members spent years in probationary stages before being admitted fully into the group. Their rules were strict, their expectations demanding, their sense of purpose enormous. And yet there is something quietly moving about imagining them there. A small group of people, perhaps a few hundred at most, at the edge of a salt sea in the ancient desert, believing with everything they had that what they were doing mattered. Copying old words, writing new ones, preserving something precious against the darkness they felt closing in. They were not wrong that darkness was coming. The Romans arrived in 68 CE. The community, by most accounts, hid their scrolls in the caves and fled or were killed. The jars were sealed, the linen was wrapped around the leather, and then the long silence began. Nearly 2,000 years of it. Chapter 2. What was written and what it means. The scrolls themselves are extraordinary in their variety. They are not one thing. They are many things from many times in several languages on different materials, covering an enormous range of subjects. The majority, over 3/4, are written in Hebrew. Others are in Aramaic, the common spoken language of much of the ancient Near East, and a smaller number are in Greek. They are written on parchment, which is to say animal skin that has been prepared for writing, and on papyrus, the reed-based material that was common in Egypt. And then there is one scroll that is entirely different from all the others. A scroll made not of skin or plant fiber, but of copper. We will come back to that one. Among the most significant of all the scrolls are those that contain the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the oldest complete manuscripts of the Hebrew Scriptures dated from around the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. The Masoretic text, as it is known, carefully copied and preserved by Jewish scribes called the Masoretes, was the foundation of almost everything scholars knew about the ancient biblical text. Then Qumran happened, and suddenly there were manuscripts 1,000 years older. The Great Isaiah Scroll is perhaps the most famous of them all. Found in that first cave, the cave of the broken pottery, it is approximately 24 feet long. 7.5 meters of carefully stitched parchment sheets, covered in column after column of ancient Hebrew script. It contains all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah, complete, intact, remarkably well preserved after more than 2 millennia in the dry desert air. When scholars compared it to the Masoretic text, they found something quietly wonderful, but the substance, the meaning, the message remained intact. This was deeply significant. It told scholars something important about the care with which ancient scribes had approached their work. These were not careless copiers. They understood what they were preserving. They took it seriously in a way that time has now confirmed. But not every scroll confirmed what was already known. Some introduced texts that were entirely unfamiliar. Among the most intriguing of these are the sectarian documents, the texts that appear to have been composed by the Qumran community itself, reflecting their own particular beliefs and practices. The community rule, sometimes called the Manual of Discipline, describes the life of the group in striking detail. How new members were initiated, how disputes were resolved, the penalties for various transgressions, the community's understanding of itself as a remnant of the truly faithful, set apart from a corrupt world, living in readiness for the great final battle between the forces of light and darkness. That last image, the cosmic war between light and darkness, appears in another of the community's own texts, one known as the War Scroll. It describes in careful, almost tactical detail how this final battle will unfold, which tribe will fight on which flank, what the trumpets will sound, how the priests will organize the camp. It reads, in places, like a military manual for an army that never assembled, preparing for a war that was understood to be both earthly and heavenly at once. There are also the Thanksgiving hymns, a collection of psalms and poems that many scholars believe were composed by the community's founding leader, a figure referred to in the text simply as the teacher of righteousness. These are deeply personal in tone, full of gratitude and also anguish. a voice speaking from the edge of something vast, aware of its own smallness, and yet certain of its place in a larger story. Reading them, even in translation, even at a distance of 2,000 years, there is something that feels recognizable. The voice of someone who has known difficulty, who has been misunderstood, who holds tight to a sense of meaning in the face of a world that seems not to share it. Then there are the commentaries, texts called pesharim, which take passages from the Hebrew prophets and interpret them as referring directly to events in the community's own time. The ancient words of Habakkuk or Nahum are read not as history but as prophecy, as coded descriptions of the Roman legions or the corrupt priests of Jerusalem. It is a method of reading that says, these old words are speaking to us, here, now. And perhaps in some way they still are. Every book of what would become the Old Testament is represented among the scrolls, at least in part. Everyone with a single quiet exception. The Book of Esther. No fragment, no trace, no copy of Esther has ever been found at Qumran. Scholars have speculated about why. Perhaps the community did not consider it canonical. Perhaps the book's lack of any explicit mention of God made it unsuitable for their purposes. Perhaps the scroll simply did not survive. The absence remains like a small, intriguing gap in an otherwise vast collection. Chapter 3. The Copper Scroll and the Hidden Gold. And now the scroll made of metal. Found in Cave 3 in 1952, the Copper Scroll is unlike anything else in the entire collection. It is not a literary text. It is not a religious document. It is not a commentary or a hymn or a set of rules. It is a list. A list of 64 locations. And at each location, according to the text, there is hidden treasure. Gold, silver, vessels, priestly vestments, scrolls of their own, buried separately. The quantities described are enormous. Scholars have attempted to calculate the total and arrived at figures suggesting hundreds of tons of precious metal, an amount that would represent a significant portion of the wealth of the ancient temple in Jerusalem. The scroll itself is made of nearly pure copper, which is why it survived in conditions that would have destroyed leather or papyrus. When it was found, it had corroded into a rigid cylinder. It could not be unrolled without destroying it. Eventually, in 1955, it was carefully cut into strips in a laboratory in Manchester, England, and the text inside was finally read for the first time in 2,000 years. What the scholars found was written in a form of Hebrew that differs from the other scrolls, more colloquial, more practical, as if written by someone whose concern was not elegance but precision. Each entry follows a similar pattern. Go to such and such a place. Dig at the third step. Beneath the threshold. Under the eastern corner. Ooh. There you will find a quantity of silver. Or gold? Or both. The directions are specific enough to be tantalizing and vague enough to be maddening. Place names that have not survived, landmarks that have long since vanished, measurements that depend on structures no longer standing. Many expeditions have gone looking, none have found anything. Which raises a question that has never been satisfactorily answered: was the treasure real? Some scholars believe it was, that the Copper Scroll records the actual hiding of the temple treasury before the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, when the priests and the community may have scattered their wealth across the Judean wilderness to keep it from the legions. If so, it is still out there somewhere, buried under 2,000 years of rock and sand and the slow accumulation of time. Others are less certain. The amounts described are so vast, they argue, as to be implausible. Perhaps the scroll is something else entirely. A record of an imagined or symbolic treasure. A sacred text whose meaning operates on a level we have not yet understood. A kind of encoded document whose real contents remain locked behind a language of metaphor. And then there are those who simply say, "We do not know. We may never know." And there is something almost restful in that, in the idea that some mysteries are allowed to remain mysteries, that not everything needs to be solved, that the copper scroll can sit in its museum case in Amman, Jordan, its 64 secrets still intact, and the world can continue to turn without any of them being revealed. The treasure, if it exists, has been patient for 2,000 years. A little more time will not trouble it. Chapter 4. The Scholars, the Decades, and the Long Road to Publication. The story of the scrolls does not end with their discovery. In some ways, it only becomes more complicated there. When the initial scrolls from Cave 1 were found, there was enormous excitement and a degree of remarkable speed in getting them studied and published. Eliezer Sukenik, the Hebrew University archaeologist, acquired 3 of the original 7 scrolls from Cave 1. He worked on them with urgency and devotion, aware that he was looking at something that might reshape the entire field of biblical scholarship. He died in 1953, before his work was complete, but not before he had grasped the magnitude of what he held. The other 4 scrolls from Cave 1 made a more complicated journey. They passed through the hands of the Syrian Archbishop Athanasius Yeshua Samuel, who brought them to the United States hoping to sell them. And this is where one of the more quietly astonishing footnotes in the story of the scrolls appears. On June 1st, 1954, an advertisement appeared in the Wall Street Journal. A small notice in the classified section, the kind of thing you might glance at while looking for something else entirely. It offered 4 Dead Sea Scrolls for sale, ancient manuscripts of priceless historical and religious significance, available for purchase. The price was not listed. Inquiries were invited. The scrolls were eventually purchased by Yigael Yadin. The scrolls came home to Israel, where they are now housed in a purpose-built museum in Jerusalem called the Shrine of the Book, designed to echo the shape of the clay jar lids in which the first scrolls were found. But the publication of the scrolls from the other caves, particularly the enormous haul of fragments from Cave 4, became one of the more frustrating episodes in the history of modern scholarship. Sorting them, identifying them, and publishing them was a vast undertaking. A small international team was assembled and given exclusive access to the material. And then the work slowed. Decades passed. Scholars who were not on the team had no access to the texts. They could not study them, could not verify readings, could not contribute their own expertise to the work of understanding. The scrolls sat in the Palestine Archaeological Museum in East Jerusalem, and the team worked at a pace that its critics described as glacial. By the 1980s, frustration in the wider scholarly community had grown into something close to open protest. There were accusations of monopoly, of intellectual gatekeeping, of a small group holding the ancient world hostage to their own pace and preferences. The team defended itself, pointing to the genuine difficulty of the material, the painstaking care required, the sheer volume of the work. The situation began to change in the early 1990s. In 1991, the Huntington Library in California, which held a complete set of photographs of the scrolls, decided to open its collection to all qualified scholars. the monopoly was effectively broken. Photographs were released. Computerized databases were assembled. The full publication of the scrolls, which finally came through a series of volumes in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert series, was completed only in 2009. More than 60 years after that first cave was found. It is a long time. Long enough that some of the scholars who began the work did not live to see it finished. Long enough that the field had transformed several times over in the intervening years. But the scrolls themselves were patient. They had already waited 2,000 years. 60 more was nothing to them. And so we come to the present, and to the ways that the scrolls are still being understood, still being read in new ways, still yielding quiet surprises to those who approach them with care and curiosity. In recent years, technology has opened doors that no amount of careful scholarship alone could have managed. Researchers have been using artificial intelligence to study the handwriting in the scrolls, and what they have found is gently fascinating. A team led by Professor Mladen Popovic at the University of Groningen developed an AI program they named Enoch, after the ancient biblical figure who walked with God and was taken. Enoch was trained on samples from scrolls whose dates had already been established through radiocarbon testing, and then it was set to work on manuscripts whose dates were less certain. What Enoch found in a study published in 2025 was that some of the scrolls are older than anyone had previously believed. Most remarkably, a copy of the Book of Daniel, known to scholars as 4Q1 and 4D, was dated by Enoch to somewhere between 230 and 160 years before the Common Era. This is decades earlier than the paleographic estimates that had previously guided scholarship. It places the manuscript's creation in the same general era as the presumed writing of Daniel itself, which changes the picture in subtle but meaningful ways. A copy of Ecclesiastes, the book of wisdom and gentle melancholy, that begins with the words, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity," was found by the same analysis to be perhaps a century older than previously thought. Which means that when the scribes at Qumran were copying it, the ink of the original may barely have been dry. The AI also noticed something that human paleographers had not quite seen so clearly before. The different styles of ancient Hebrew handwriting that scholars had thought evolved in a neat sequence, one giving way to the next, actually coexisted for much longer than anyone had assumed. The Hasmonean style and the Herodian style, named for the dynasties under which they were thought to flourish, were not sequential like chapters in a book. They were simultaneous, like two dialects spoken in the same city. Scribes trained in one tradition worked alongside scribes trained in another, and the categories we had imposed on them were neater than the reality they described. This is one of the things that makes the scrolls so alive, even now. They keep gently correcting our assumptions. They keep suggesting that the past was more complex, more layered, more various than our categories can quite hold. Beyond the AI work, researchers have been conducting DNA analysis of the animal hides used to make the scrolls. The parchment, after all, was once a living creature, a goat or a sheep or in some cases a wild ibex, and the genetic material in that ancient skin can still be read. What the DNA analysis has revealed is quietly remarkable in its own way. Scrolls that appeared, based on their content and handwriting, to be closely related were sometimes found to have been made from animals that were also closely related. The same herd, perhaps. The same region. The same season's slaughter. This suggests that at least some of the scrolls were produced in organized batches by scribal workshops that sourced their materials from particular suppliers. But in other cases, the DNA told a different story. fragments that scholars had assumed came from the same original scroll because they fitted together physically or shared the same handwriting, were found to come from animals with no genetic relationship at all. Different animals from different places whose skins had been joined together or whose fragments had been mistakenly grouped. The scrolls are more complicated, more composite, more various in their origins than they appear. Professor Popovich has since launched a new 5-year project supported by a substantial grant from the European Research Council called Tracing Scribes and Scrolls. It brings together historians and archaeologists, yes, but also material scientists and chemists and specialists in the physical study of manuscripts. The goal is to understand not just what the scrolls say, but where they were made. Which scriptorium produced which text? How knowledge moved through ancient Judea from one community to another, from one hand to another, across the long distances of the ancient world. It is a project that treats the scrolls not only as texts, but as objects. Things that were made by people, in places, at times, with materials that came from somewhere and were prepared by someone. The scroll as artifact, as much as the scroll as scripture. And in that dual attention, something new is being seen. The question of where the scrolls were made is still open. Were they all produced at Qumran, in that quiet scriptorium on the edge of the Salt Sea? Or were some of them brought from Jerusalem, from other communities, from scribal schools we know nothing about? The answer, when it comes, will reshape our understanding of how ancient Jewish knowledge was preserved and transmitted, of how a community at the margins of the world maintained its connection to the center. And the caves themselves remain a subject of quiet wonder. 11 caves, spread across the limestone cliffs and ravines near Qumran, each with its own character and its own story. Cave 1, where it all began with its tall clay jars and their linen-wrapped contents. Cave 4, the great fragmentary cave whose thousands of tiny pieces have occupied scholars for generations. Cave 3, where the copper scroll waited in its rigid cylinder, its secrets still largely intact. In 2017, a 12th cave was identified in the same area, though it appeared to have been looted, possibly in the 1950s, before archaeologists could reach it. Pottery fragments were found. The cave gave up its evidence of absence and kept its own counsel. There is something in that image that stays with me. A cave full of the preparations for writing, the materials ready, the parchment waiting. And then nothing. The words that might have been written there, whatever they would have said, are simply gone, lost in a long silence between then and now. Perhaps they were not so different from us, those quiet people at the edge of the Dead Sea. They too were trying to hold on to something in the face of time. They too felt the weight of what they carried, the importance of what they knew, the fragility of what they loved. They wrapped their words in linen and sealed them in clay and trusted the darkness to keep them safe. The darkness did. For 2,000 years it did. And now those words are with us, here, in this present moment that would have been unimaginable to them. Read by machines trained on ancient handwriting. Analyzed by chemists who can read the DNA in long-dead animal skin. Studied in the soft light of museum reading rooms by scholars who have given their lives to understanding what those careful scribes were trying to say. The great Isaiah scroll sits in its case in Jerusalem, all 24 feet of it, every chapter preserved, every column of ancient script still legible. The copper scroll sits in Amman, its 64 secrets still in place. The fragments of Genesis and Deuteronomy and Numbers and Ecclesiastes and Daniel, dated now to earlier times than we imagined, continue to be studied and restudied, each reading revealing something that the last one missed. The teacher of righteousness, whoever he was, wrote his thanksgiving hymns in the desert heat and did not know that anyone would read them. The scribes who copied Isaiah did not know that their copy would outlast by a millennium every other copy made before or since. The person who hammered the locations of treasure into a sheet of copper did not know that the treasure would remain hidden while the copper survived to tell its story. None of them knew. And yet, here we are. There is something quietly beautiful in the idea that the most durable things are often the ones made with the most care. The scribes at Qumran were not in a hurry. They prepared their parchment with patience. They ruled their lines with precision. They dipped their pens and drew their letters with attention, not because they expected to be remembered, but because they believed that what they were doing mattered. The desert kept their work. The dry air and the sealed jars and the deep limestone caves held the fragile leather and papyrus safe across centuries that saw empires rise and fall, languages shift and fade, entire civilizations build themselves up and dissolve again into the earth. And a shepherd boy threw a rock and heard the sound of breaking pottery, and the long silence ended. The night is very quiet now. The day, with everything it held, has grown distant. The desert, the caves, the careful scribes, the ancient words preserved in darkness, all of it settles into something soft and still. Somewhere behind you, those clay jars are still sealed in the imagination, the linen still wrapped, the words still waiting. Patient, unhurried, safe. Drift now, if you're ready. Sleep well. Chapter 2 deserves a little more time spent inside it because the scrolls themselves contain so many quiet corners that a single pass through them can only gesture at what is there. Among the most tenderly human of all the discovered texts is a fragment known as the horoscope scroll, or 4Q186. It describes the physical and spiritual characteristics of people born under different signs, matching the proportions of light and darkness in a person's soul to the position of the stars at their birth. The community at Qumran is often thought of as fiercely opposed to the wider Hellenistic culture surrounding them, and in many ways they were. And yet here, in their own handwriting, is a document that draws on the astrological traditions of the Greek and Babylonian world, adapted into their own framework of light and darkness, spirit and flesh. They were, like most people in most times, more porous to the world around them than their strictest principles might suggest. There is also the Temple Scroll, the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls at nearly 9 meters, which describes an idealized version of the Jerusalem Temple, its dimensions, its courts, its festivals, its laws, in a voice that presents itself not as the writing of a human author, but as the direct speech of God. Where other books of the Hebrew Bible might say, "The Lord commanded Moses," the Temple Scroll simply says, "I command." Was it a rival to the established Torah or a supplement to it? The answer, as with so much here, has not yet fully settled. And then there are the smaller, quieter fragments that say almost nothing and somehow say a great deal. A scrap of parchment with only a few words visible, the rest eaten away by time. A torn edge where a sentence begins and does not finish. A smear of ink where a scribe pressed too hard or paused too long. These fragments are, in their own way, as moving as the complete scrolls. They are the evidence of incompleteness, of things that were almost said, of voices that were nearly audible and then fell silent. One fragment, catalogued as 4Q477, appears to record the actual disciplinary proceedings of the community. Real names appear in it. Real accusations. One man is recorded as having been rebuked for being short-tempered. Another for a transgression involving his relatives. The details are partial, the context unclear, but the fragment has the feeling of minutes taken at a meeting. People sitting together, deciding how to handle a difficulty that had arisen among them. It is almost mundane. And it is exactly that quality of the mundane, the ordinary, the recognizably human that makes it so affecting. These were not abstract figures. They were people who got angry, who had difficult relationships with their families, who needed to be reminded of the rules they had agreed to follow. They were trying, imperfectly, to live according to something they believed in deeply in a harsh landscape, far from the comforts of the city, with the weight of what they felt was an ending age pressing down on them. The scrolls contain medical texts too. Recipes for remedies, descriptions of symptoms. There are astrological physiognomies that link the shape of a person's body to their moral character, a way of reading the outer form as a map of the inner life. There are calendrical texts that reflect the community's insistence on using a solar calendar rather than the lunar one followed in Jerusalem, a difference that placed them out of step with the temple's festivals and reinforced their sense of being a separate people, observing a truer rhythm beneath the official one. The calendrical dispute matters more than it might seem. If you celebrate Passover on a different day from the temple, you are not simply keeping a different date. You are making a statement about who has the authority to determine when the sacred moments arrive. The community at Qumran believed the priests in Jerusalem had gotten the calendar wrong, that the festivals were being held at the wrong times, that the entire official religious life of the nation was, in a precise and measurable sense, out of alignment with the heavens. It was one of the things that had driven them into the desert in the first place. The sense that the world had drifted from its true pattern and that only they could see it clearly. There is a text called the New Jerusalem Scroll, found in fragments across several caves, which describes in elaborate visionary detail a future city, vast and perfectly ordered, its streets measured in reeds, its gates named for the 12 tribes, its architecture, a kind of divine geometry. A city imagined in the desert by people who had left the only city that mattered to them and who consoled themselves with the vision of a better one to come. Reading it, you can feel the longing in it. The distance. The ache of exile chosen for the sake of something believed to be more important than comfort. And perhaps that is the thread that runs through all of it. Through the careful copying of ancient scripture, and the writing of new hymns, and the cataloguing of hidden treasure, and the recording of community discipline, and the dreaming of perfect cities, a group of people who felt with great intensity that the world as it was had fallen short of the world as it should be, and who responded to that feeling not with despair, but with extraordinary, patient, meticulous care. They wrote things down. They preserved what they could. They wrapped it in linen and sealed it in clay and trusted the darkness to hold it. The Damascus document is another of the community's own compositions, and it takes its name from the references within it to a community in Damascus, though whether this refers to a literal settlement in Syria or to some symbolic place of exile is still debated. The text describes the community's own history in the language of covenant and wandering, casting their founder, the teacher of righteousness, as a figure who led a faithful remnant out of corruption and into the desert, much as Moses had led the Israelites out of Egypt into the wilderness. The parallels are deliberate. The community understood its own story through the lens of the oldest stories it knew. It found its meaning by placing itself inside a much larger narrative, one that had been unfolding for centuries before any of them were born. This is something that human beings have always done. We place ourselves inside stories. We find the narrative that makes our own difficulty meaningful, that connects our particular moment to something older and larger and more enduring. They knew their texts, knew the traditions, knew the arguments. And they chose, with full awareness, to read their own lives as part of a story that had been going on for a very long time. The Pesharim, those running commentaries on the prophets, are the most vivid expression of this. The Kittim, a name used in the text for the dominant foreign power, are identified by most scholars as the Romans. The wicked priest, a recurring figure in the Pesharim, is thought to refer to one of the high priests in Jerusalem who had opposed or persecuted the teacher of righteousness. The specifics are debated. The identity of the wicked priest has been assigned by different scholars to at least 5 different historical figures, but the spirit of the reading is clear. That impulse to read old words and find in them a mirror for the present did not end at Qumran. It has been one of the most persistent features of how human beings have engaged with sacred texts across every tradition and every era. The community at Qumran simply did it with unusual thoroughness and left behind the evidence. The scrolls also include fragments of texts that were known from other sources but whose full Hebrew or Aramaic originals had been lost. The Book of Tobit, a narrative that survived in Greek and Latin translations, was found at Qumran in both Aramaic and Hebrew, confirming that it had originally circulated in Semitic languages before being translated. The Book of Enoch, a vast and strange visionary text describing the fall of heavenly beings and the journeys of the ancient patriarch through the cosmos, was found in Aramaic fragments that push its composition back further than the Greek manuscripts that had previously been the earliest evidence of its existence. Enoch is a particularly fascinating case. The book had been lost to most of the Western tradition for centuries. It survived in full only in the Ge'ez language of Ethiopia, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which considers it scripture. For a long time, scholars in Europe knew of its existence, mostly through quotations and references in other texts. Then James Bruce, a Scottish explorer, brought 3 copies of the Ethiopian Enoch back to Europe in the 1770s, and the text began to be studied again. And then Qumran happened. And suddenly there were Aramaic fragments of Enoch that were older than anything else known to exist, fragments that confirmed the text's great antiquity and its circulation in the very circles that produced the other Dead Sea Scrolls. The community valued Enoch. They read it, copied it, kept it alongside what we would now call the canonical books of the Bible. This tells us something about the fluidity of the concept of Scripture in this period. The boundaries between what was authoritative and what was not were not yet fixed in the way they would later become. The canon was still, in a sense, in conversation, still being negotiated, still open. It was a world in which the text that would become the Bible was still becoming.